Thank you all so much. Ali, thanks very much for that very warm introduction. It's great to be here. Thank you for showing up on such a cold evening. I want to say special thanks to Nikolai for helping to make all of this happen. This is my first time in Little Rock. I always love coming to the South. As you could probably tell from my resume, I am a conservative, but I've spent most of my life in New York and California, and those aren't exactly places that are friendly to conservatism. And while I understand that there are folks with all kinds of different opinions here in Little Rock, I do feel that when I come to the South, I get to see more people who are politically like-minded in one day than I would in probably an entire year in San Francisco or New York. So it's great to be here. I am honored to speak at the Clinton School of Public Service. My book, Chinese Girl in the Ghetto, discusses at length my experience of immigrating to and growing up in inner city Oakland, California. When my family first moved to the United States from communist China, we had no idea that our fate was going to be so intimately intertwined with the lives of those in the African American community. But we showed up in a predominantly black town that was becoming increasingly Hispanic and increasingly Asian due to immigration. And that experience became integral to my journey of getting to know America and getting to know freedom. When you grow up in a place with a lot of black, Hispanic, and Asian people, I guess you get used to the presence of minorities in your life, and you get used to the idea that they're not just there for show, and they're not there to make you feel good about yourself, like they so often are at all kinds of elite institutions across this country. And I guess I would obviously tell you more about my experience in a little bit, but I guess one upshot of growing up in the inner city is that I acquired a certain comfort with talking to and talking about other minorities, and it's a comfort that the politically correct folks generally tell me that I shouldn't have, and that sometimes it makes other minorities uncomfortable as well. But I do hope that they would at least perceive my opinions as being truthful. I had the pleasure of visiting President Clinton's library earlier this afternoon, and it brought back a lot of memories of the 90s, but in a lot of exhibits at the library, President Clinton refers to himself as a child of the South. In many ways, I am a child of the ghetto. And obviously, President Clinton and I don't share political views, but it is a great honor to tell my story here at a school named after him. After all, he is the man that's affectionately and unofficially known as our first black president of this country, so it's a great honor to be at this venue. Before I was a child of the ghetto, I was a child of Guangzhou. That is the third largest city in China. And people ask me all the time why my family decided to leave Guangzhou for Oakland, California. The most simple answer is that everybody back then wanted to leave China for America. These days, politicians from President Obama to Senator Marco Rubio are talking about tackling income inequality. Lots of people are talking about fairness, for instance. When I was growing up in China, there was plenty of fairness everywhere, and it was because everybody was poor. There was very little income inequality. And that was before the country became the second largest economy in the world that it currently is. But back then, this was before China began to undertake its economic reforms in 1978. And even during the early parts of the reforms, what everybody noticed was that we were just as poor as everybody else. Now, how did China make it so fair? Well, the state was everywhere. It told you where you could live, where you could work, what you could buy, and for how much. And because the state allocated resources in the economy, there often wasn't enough for everybody. In the cities, for instance, in the city that I lived in Guangzhou, everybody got food stamps and oil stamps every month. Here in America, obviously, we're having a debate about food stamps, where lots of people feel that it is cruel to cut off subsidies to folks who are receiving food stamps or to reduce those subsidies. Back in China, the subsidies definitely came from the state, but there was absolutely nothing great about it, because if the state, for instance, allotted you a certain number of food stamps every month and it gave you food stamps that made you eligible for perhaps 1 kilo of rice a month, after you exhausted those food stamps, there was no more rice. And you couldn't just go onto the open market and buy some more rice, because back then there was no open market. And this was how you were allotted your food and your oil and other necessities. In China back then, when I was growing up, you were allotted certain things. So for instance, people were allotted a certain amount that they could purchase for pork, for beef, and once upon a time, I had an aunt who wanted to purchase beef, and she ended up having to trade her stamps for beef, or her stamps for pork, with certain Muslims who were non-observant, because beef was so scarce back then that it was only given to people who didn't want to eat pork. And for my aunt's non-Muslim friends, they were supposedly religious, and their religious prohibitions supposedly gave them the ability to purchase beef. But in those days, you couldn't just go buy beef anytime, anywhere, for however much you wanted to. So certainly receiving those subsidies weren't exactly a blessing. And so for my family, we lived in an apartment that had no running hot water, no modern toilet facilities, no refrigerator, no washer, no dryer, no color television. And it was that poverty, that sort of backwardness, that sort of scarcity that led us to leave for America. And when we had the chance to come here, we immediately took it. Oakland was the place that we came to. We didn't know anything about it, but that didn't really matter, because it was America and this was where we wanted to come. Yet instead of finding streets that were paved with gold, we found the ghetto, and one by one the horrors of the ghetto showed themselves to us. There was lots and lots of poverty and urban decay. Storefronts had shattered windows, streets were pockmarked with potholes, bridges and tunnels were splashed with graffiti, and then the streets downtown smelled of urine. Homeless men and women aggressively panhandled, and they accosted tourists and residents alike, and that was when they were being nice to you. Crime terrorized us. Drug dealing seemed more prevalent than employment. Muggings took place in plain sight, and gunshots rang outside my window on a regular basis, frequently interrupting my TV watching. And one day, my dad found a bullet lodged on the side of the house. There apparently was a gunfight the night before or a few days before when we weren't paying attention. Racism also ruled the town. Asians, it didn't matter if we were Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean, or Japanese, and we only had one name, and that was Chinaman, and that was the most flattering name we could have. Racial slurs that were far more obscene were regularly hurled at Asians all around town, everywhere and anywhere. And teenagers frequently terrorized Asian immigrants for fun, and criminals targeted Asian victims for cash or their belongings. But such horrific acts of racism were usually perpetrated by the black majority in a black town. It did not fit the politically correct narrative of our culture, so mainstream society and the mainstream media just looked away. In the ghetto, there was a general breakdown of law and order, an overwhelming absence of personal responsibility, and a widespread sense of entitlement. We had showed up in the heart of the welfare state, and this was a place where food stamps, welfare checks, gangbanging, and broken families reigned. For my immediate family, we either didn't qualify or didn't know about the myriad government benefits that were available. This turned out to be a blessing in disguise because we had to fight our way out of poverty the old-fashioned way. We worked. We had limited financial resources, so my parents worked long hours at menial jobs, at first for less than minimum wage. We wore clothing purchased from Goodwill or the Salvation Army or handed down from our relatives. We used second, third, or fourth-hand furniture. And at first, my brother and I each slept on half a bed. He slept on the box springs and I slept on the mattress. There was hardship and there was shared sacrifice. The mother, who was once a very well-respected school teacher in China, became a seamstress in a sweatshop. The father, who used to be trailed by a line of apprentices at a factory as a senior mechanic in China, worked as a kitchen help for a Chinese restaurant where the owners regularly verbally abused their employees. The children studied instead of skipping school, doing drugs, joining a gang, or otherwise hanging out somewhere on the streets. Through it all, we did not demand that the government level the playing field by giving us handouts or freebies. We accepted that life was unfair and that not everybody could be fortunate enough to be born rich or even to be born in this country. We did not occupy public buildings. We didn't urinate on the streets. We didn't steal other people's property. We didn't violate city ordinances, not even when things didn't go our way. We never felt entitled to government largesse or other people's money. We also didn't demand that America grant us racial preferences based on our race. Back then, being Asian in California pretty much meant that no such preferences were granted to Asians by the state. We were oftentimes actively discriminated against by state institutions that placed either hard or soft quotas, or they're actually caps, either hard or soft caps on participation by Asian people. We were minorities for sure, and many of us minorities were actually very poor compared to other minorities, but we were not underrepresented minorities, and so there were caps placed on our participation in various state institutions. Regardless, we got out of the ghetto. We certainly didn't do it alone. There were, despite the chaos and the brokenness of the ghetto, there were many, many people who offered a helping hand and a warm smile, and they showed us decency instead of hate and kindness over ignorance. But we also didn't do it by receiving a welfare check. My story is one that many on the political left refuse to believe. This is because, in part because they refuse to hear that the unpleasant reality in the brokenness of America's inner cities could entail racism by minorities. That some of the most horrific acts of racial hatred stem not just from ignorance, but from society's inability or unwillingness to hold racist individuals responsible is something that a lot of people don't want to hear about. There are obviously racists of all stripes, but when racism is perpetrated by one minority against another, lots of people would prefer to look away. That acknowledgement does not detract from the very real racism that lots of minorities do face, but acknowledging the reality does help to fight the other types of racism, a new type of racism that exists in places like the ghetto. More important, however, I think my story has been very irritating to a lot of people because it contradicts a different narrative, and it's a narrative that many on the left would prefer not to believe in, or it's a narrative that somebody could actually get out of dire circumstances without benefiting from an immense amount of aid from the government. Lots of people, since the financial crisis in 2008, have been peddling a certain narrative, and they say that the little people at the bottom of our society simply can't get a fair shake, and millionaires and billionaires, or the richest 1%, have edged out everyone else from opportunities for success. America's economy has become a club for the privileged few, and unless the government intervenes or spends heavily in the economy, the poor and the middle class will never thrive. This is a paradigm built on the mentality that absolves individuals of personal responsibility, consigns them to grievance, and encourages or perhaps even justifies their sense of entitlement. And this is a reality that my story contradicts. No one denies that there is economic inequality. The odds were certainly stacked against my family, just as the odds are always stacked against the poor. But the reality is that getting out of poverty is not a cakewalk. It's not supposed to be a cakewalk. Not everyone is fortunate enough to be born rich. That's why you work harder, you pursue your opportunities more aggressively, and you become more entrepreneurial. Unfortunately, we as a society have become so conditioned to believing that whenever we are in need, it is this government that is supposed to step in and help us, and that it is more of other people's money that we are entitled to. A while ago, I attended a conference that was catered toward very conscientious types who were out to save the world. And on one of the panel discussions, a very sincere young man told a story about how his dad was having financial difficulties. His dad is a veteran. And this young man said when he graduated from Harvard Law School, he got a very high-paying job at a fancy law firm in New York. And he said even though he really didn't care all that much about what he was doing and didn't like his job all that much, he was making a lot more money than his dad could ever imagine. And he felt that if people like him needed to pay more in taxes so that people like his dad could do a little bit better financially, then he was all for doing that. Well, I graduated from law school myself, and I also used to work for a law firm in New York City. And I also used to and continue to worry constantly about the financial well-being of my parents, who do not have a pension and draw from minuscule Social Security benefits every month. But when I was a lawyer, I didn't actually clamor for the government to take more money from rich people in New York to give to my parents. This certainly wasn't because I was somehow fond of all the obnoxious bankers and hedge fund guys and private equity people who were making about 7 figures more than I was. And it certainly wasn't because I was somehow paying cheap rent in New York City. It also wasn't because I wasn't paying enough taxes of my own. Rather, from my point of view, I felt that the most direct solution to taking care of my parents was for me to do my part. That was the spirit that guided my family out of the ghetto. And I believe that it's the spirit that can guide others out of poverty. I'm not here to argue that the government has no role in our economy or in our lives. What I am saying is that we have to fundamentally re-examine many of the assumptions and preconceptions about what it means to be free men and women, what it means to be in charge of our own destiny, and how we can do for ourselves and our family all those things that we're perfectly capable of doing but have ceded to the federal government or our state government for far too long. For me, I discovered that even in the ghetto, people have a chance to walk away from some of the worst attributes of a free society and into its finest virtues. In this country, I believe that those virtues are available to everyone else too, whatever their color and however modest their background. And I hope that that's the message that shines through my book. And if you're interested in following my work, my website is yingma.org. That's yingma.org, and I would be glad to take any of your questions. Thank you so much.
We do have time for some questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you.
I've been to China 3 times, and the thing that worries me is that there seems to be a real gap in our perception of the Chinese people. We hear, for instance, that I noticed myself how friendly the Chinese people were and how every single person worked, whether it was to carry their own little shoebox to polish your shoes or whatever. And yet the government itself comes off as just being really horrible in so many ways. I don't understand that gap.
Well, I think the government is indeed horrible in so many ways. There's a lot of abuse, there's torture, the freedom of speech is not a right that is widely available to people. There are lots of problems, there's lots of repression. The government, however, has made lots and lots of improvements in the past 3.5 decades, and for good reason, it can claim some credit for the massive economic expansion that has taken place in China. And so when it says that it is responsible for the newfound wealth that many Chinese people now have, there is actually a fair amount of credibility in that claim. I think that the government and the government of China and the United States have a very complicated relationship. That on the one hand, the United States and China collaborate on a wide range of issues, particularly in the area of trade, for instance. But there are lots of other things we don't agree about, and because the Chinese government doesn't represent the Chinese people, there are numerous practices that are of great concern to us. So for instance, China has been flexing its muscles in the South China Sea and East China Sea. There are lots of maritime disputes that China has in those areas with America's allies, Japan, for instance. And there is a great deal of risk that military conflict could sort of just get out of control. And those are some of the things that people in the US government worry about. It doesn't mean that just because folks criticize China, when people in the US government criticize China for its human rights abuses, for its very opaque military buildup, for its aggressive for its aggressive way of patrolling the South China Sea. It doesn't mean that they're hostile to the Chinese people, and I don't think that Chinese people are hostile against America. In fact, many are very curious about America and would love to befriend an American. However, they are very nationalistic these days, and their nationalism can often be whipped up. And so if they feel that the United States is somehow disrespectful of China, disrespectful of them, their nationalism can be misused and directed toward the U.S. as hostility. So I think it's complicated because unlike in the United States, the government in China does not represent the people in China. There aren't popular elections, and so a lot of times what the Chinese government says is the Chinese government would say, well, you know, the United States doing A, B, C, or D all of those actions hurt the feelings of 1.3 Chinese people. Well, you know, those 1.3 billion Chinese people have not voted under a communist regime for their leaders. How would the leaders know? But the dynamic is such that that a lot of times, as a result of a press that's not completely free, Chinese people do get misinformation. Their sense of nationalism can get wounded very easily, and so those are some of the issues that do plague the bilateral relationship. But I would agree with you that a lot of Chinese people hold very friendly views of Americans.
Yes, sir.
You touched on when you came here as a family unit. Do most Chinese families come here together? And would you think that would probably be why you do a better job of working your way out of poverty?
Well, I certainly think that working your way out of poverty as a family gives you better chances. In terms of whether Chinese people come here as families, not necessarily. I think a lot of people during the days when I showed up here in the 80s, and so during those days to come legally, for the most part, a lot of people came to reunite with their family members who were already here. In subsequent years, it's become much more common for people to come here to go to school, and so many of those folks would show up at American universities by themselves. But as a college student, usually you're not struggling with the level of poverty that people in certain other parts of the country, for instance, the inner city, would be struggling with. In recent years, in recent decades, there has also been a lot of illegal immigration from China, and so plenty of those folks come here by themselves rather than with their family. I don't know what the statistics are and how it all breaks down, but I think that, you know, it helps for a lot of immigrant families. It helps to be able to rely on the family. So, you know, children do a lot of things that regular American children growing up in this country wouldn't do, and then the parents also do the same thing. And I think that shared sacrifice helps pull a lot of families together and out of poverty.
Yes, sir.
François Guillou, thank you very much for this great testimony today.
Thank you.
I lived in China for 5 years, and I agree with everything that you said. The American dream is still very alive in the minds of a lot of Chinese. So my question today would be, what would be your advice for all of us to integrate and to welcome these Chinese that are still coming from China to the United States today and to Little Rock?
I would just advise treating them as you would treat other Americans. I think for people who immigrate, usually they're very big risk takers, and so if they're going to go to a new country, and especially if they're going to go to a new country without a whole lot of financial resources, they're going to be more entrepreneurial than I think a lot of folks who may have grown up in more comfortable circumstances. Or they may or may not be natural entrepreneurs, but I think a lot of these folks in a certain way are less risk averse to begin with, and so I think they're going to do everything that they can to integrate into American society. I think it helps if they could just be treated like everybody else, and there are lots of Americans who are very kind and who go out of their way to help people, whether they're immigrants or whether they're just, you know, less privileged. And I think that's one quality that a lot of immigrants have been very thankful for. It's that kindness in Americans their willingness to be charitable to strangers. I don't have any specific advice about, how one might want to interact. I think, when immigrants come to this country, there will be culture shocks and there will be cultural barriers that they would need to overcome, and there will be disagreements or perhaps even conflicts between, people of one culture and another, but you sort of hash those things out, and I think lots of immigrants don't just expect America to, to give them a handout. So obviously, that's a bit of a generalization, but since you agree with everything I say, I'm sure you will treat the immigrants with the dignity and respect they deserve.
Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to ask about the future in China. I'm really curious about, having been there twice and going back this summer, how's the government going to continue what I call controlled capitalism? How are the people's rising standard of living going to be able for the communist regime to keep the power? I see a clash. I don't know what you think, but I don't see how this is going to work. So how do you think it's going to happen?
I think it's going to be very tricky for the government. Like you said, there are people who are becoming more well off as a result of economic reforms in the last 3.5 decades, and they're demanding more and more, and the government is trying its best to, at times, repress them, at times trying to placate them, and at times trying to find ways to be more responsive to their demands. One thing that the government is doing several things. So one thing it is very keen on doing is to continue economic reforms, because despite the fact that China has liberalized its economy tremendously in the last 3.5 decades, the state is still very much involved in how the economy is run. So a couple of years ago, a congressional commission did a study, and they concluded that about 50% of China's non-agricultural GDP, in fact, is either directly or indirectly state-owned. That's not a small chunk. We complain here about the government, taking a stake in GM, taking a stake in Citi, and all of those companies that it took a stake in during in the aftermath of the financial crisis. But think about China after 3.5 decades of financial reforms. That big of a chunk, nearly 50%, is still either directly or indirectly state-owned. And so the government last year pledged to do more to allow economic liberalization to move forward. It pledged to allow the private sector to play more of a role. In fact, its exact words were, it believed that the market should play a decisive role in the continuation of economic reforms, and it believed that the market ought to play more of a role in allocating resources, because the president of China now, in fact, says that both, and this is, I'm not quoting him exactly right, but it's more or less what he said in a letter to the people, was that both theory and practice have proved that the market is the the most efficient allocator of resources. I mean, keep in mind, he's also the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, and so they have expressed this determination to make the economy more free, because they believe that by making the economy a bit more free, by liberalizing it more economic reform will take place and economic growth will materialize on a sustainable path, and that if the economic growth can be sustained, then it's much more likely that they can hold on to their power. They're not saying all of these things because they're the modern day Milton Friedman or the modern day Adam Smith. They believe that their legitimacy is intricately tied to the economic well-being of China, and if China's economy can continue to grow, even if not at double digits on an annual basis, but if it can continue to grow on a sustained basis, that would allow them the kind of legitimacy that would allow them to keep governing. In terms of other issues, everything from from the human rights abuse, people rioting, people protesting, the government is not shy about repressing people. It throws people in jail, it tortures them. It's not shy about breaking up protests, and I think one very major way that it's been able to hold on to power is to not let those protests get out of hand. So we saw in the Middle East a couple of years ago, the Arab Spring, all these people just congregated, and there were all these massive demonstrations that turned into revolutions that toppled a number of regimes. In China, what they've been doing for the last decade or more is to make sure that that small protests don't get out of hand, that they are either forcibly broken up, or sometimes the protesters are bribed, or however they're dealt with. And that's been a very key part of the Chinese government's strategy of dealing with discontent. Another part of it is it's also trying to be more responsive. It may not be accountable in the sense that it would allow that the officials would just say, okay, I'm going to step down because you're going to vote me out. It's not willing to go that far, but one way it's been willing to be a bit more responsive is to, for instance, address the corruption issue, that lots of Chinese citizens are very sick and tired of the corruption that's going on, and the top set of leaders now in office have indicated that they're very serious about tackling corruption, and they will put top officials in jail, including recently, they've put one person under house arrest, and this is the person who was one of the 9 highest-ranking members of the Communist Party just until recently. So, I mean, they're willing to show the people that they're taking some action. And so I think the government's been trying to employ all kinds of different tools to deal with a very volatile situation. But the economic growth part is key.
Yes. Right there. Sorry.
You did an excellent job of sort of outlining your political perspective. I'm curious if you can share with us, how does compassion fit into both your personal point of view and your political perspective? What role does compassion play?
When I was on a plane here yesterday, I was listening to a podcast that featured Paul Ryan, and he was at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., talking about opportunities and poverty. And someone asked him if he's a compassionate conservative, and he said he doesn't like that term because he believes that conservatism is compassionate and that we don't need to add an extra adjective to it. And that's a view that I would agree with. I believe that the free market is compassionate. I believe that the best welfare program is a job. I believe that economic growth, as evidenced by what I mentioned earlier about what happened in China, I believe that that sort of market liberalization is one of the most compassionate things that's materialized in our time, that as a result, so once again going back to the China example, as a result of the state getting out of the way, as a result of the government reducing its role in the economy, about 500 million people in China have been lifted out of poverty. So 500 million, that's actually more than the population of the United States. There are lots of examples I can give here in the US too, but my philosophy is that the free market is, to echo the words of the Chinese president, is a much more efficient allocator of resources than the state, and I believe that the conservatism and the libertarianism that embraces the free market, in fact, will produce a more compassionate result in the long term. With that said, like I said in my talk, I don't believe, I'm not one of those people who walk around saying that, the government has no role at all. I think that living in Western societies these days, it's hard to actually argue that, because there are just so many ways that the state is intricately tied to our lives. Even if we wanted the state to get out of the way, it's going to take a long process. But once again, I go back to the point that what a lot of conservatives believe is that the state creates unintended consequences. It creates inefficiencies, and in a lot of unintended ways, it also creates catastrophes or human tragedies, and that is certainly not compassionate.
Dr. Bruce?
you talk about getting out of the ghetto, and it seems as though hard work and education have been your path out of the ghetto. I wonder, with your conservatism and minimalist approach to government, what's your prescription for the ghetto?
Well, I think there are lots of people who study this area much more closely than I, and who could provide prescriptions that are much more research-based and that are more educated, perhaps. In my case, I happen to be somebody who actually made my way out of the ghetto, and one thing that certainly struck me is that in a lot of the institutions that I've been affiliated with, lots and lots of people are very interested in talking about how much they care about the inner city and how much they care about people who are poor, but I don't really encounter that many people in those types of institutions who have ever been poor and who have ever had to make their way out of poverty. So my perspective is in part a personal one, but certainly over the years my political ideology has shaped my views on a lot of things. I would echo what you just said. I think education is very key. Family is extremely important. So for instance, when I went to college at Cornell. My brother, who's 4 years older, was at home with my parents, and my parents didn't speak English fluently at the time, and even today their English skills aren't that great. And if I didn't have my brother, most likely I would not have been able to leave Oakland, California for Cornell, because I would have had to stay behind to take care of my parents. And so he wasn't planning to go anywhere anyway, so it worked out in my favor. But family, that's just one tiny little example. There are lots of other examples of how my family came together. I think family makes a huge difference. In addition to that, I think that, when I was in the ghetto, when I was going to public schools, what I noticed was that a lot of very fine teachers were just so frustrated that their students weren't listening to them. They very much wanted their students to do well, but the students were not studying, the students were not applying themselves, and they had all this potential that sort of just went, to very unproductive places. And what I found in the ghetto was that there were plenty of bad teachers, but there were also plenty of good teachers who were very good role models, but that just wasn't enough. And so once again, I come back to this idea that, if you come from a broken family, if you don't have have parents who care about your education, and you don't, and if you're not, you're not taught by your parents or your family to apply yourself at school, it does become much more difficult, which is why the family unit is that much more important for getting out of poverty. But there are people, but obviously there are plenty of people who come from broken families, and it will be more difficult for them, unfortunately.
Last one.
Hi, my name is Sring Yudan. I'm a first year student at the Clinton School of Public Service. I'm actually from a country south of China, Bhutan, and I guess my question, or I guess I have a thought in my mind. So when you're talking about personal responsibility, what came to my mind was sort of the difference between different minority groups. Say Chinese immigrants who came into America more recently compared to African American communities that have been here, for a long time, with not so colorful history of slavery, of discrimination and racism. And I guess my question is then, how does history play into that route to getting out of poverty? Or how does history not play into, or how does history play into stopping from getting out of poverty? That's my question.
Sure. So in the intro of my book, I have a line that talks about how history can make an individual self, or how history can move an individual in a more self-destructive direction, that the tragedy or agony of history and the belief by certain individuals that he's not going to be immune from that type of inequality, that does make a big difference. And it has a huge impact on people's psychology. And, you know, and it's not something that, that anyone should ever diminish, because it's a very real aspect of our society. With that said, however, I think that modern American society has a tendency to shy away from speaking honestly just because of that history. And so while we should do everything we can to rectify the wrongs of that history, it doesn't mean that somehow people who come from a background that's hurt by that history should be absolved of other responsibilities, personal responsibilities, right? So one example I would give is that while we should do everything we can to prosecute or to rectify the wrongs of white on black racism, we shouldn't shy away from condemning black racism, whether it's on Hispanics or Asians. And unfortunately, a lot of times in our society, that latter part is not something that we do well, that we dwell so much on the old racism that we don't do enough to fight the new racism. And certainly lots of people will disagree with me, but I see race-based quotas and preferences as one form of that new racism. But that's something that's celebrated in a lot of places, at a lot of elite institutions and state institutions across this country. And so we've got lots of institutions that in fact actively corroborate in the act of diminishing personal responsibility, of holding different people of different colors to the same standard. I think that, you know, I don't want to diminish the role of history, but then there is always history that people can point to. A Vietnamese person who came from, you know, war-torn Vietnam back in the days when Vietnam was at war with America. I mean, there's a lot of tragedy there. You know, there are lots of, so someone who come from another country that's been plagued by genocide, for instance, there's lots of history there too. Unfortunately, tragic things and difficult things happen in life, and that's, you know, and I think that Americans are kind people, and oftentimes they reach out to strangers who suffer from those kinds of tragedies and who are less fortunate. But I think that at the same time, we as a society shouldn't absolve individuals of responsibility simply because they come from, you know, a more modest background or a less fortunate history. Yes.
Thank you so much for coming, and thank you all for coming out. I appreciate it, and we'll see you at the next one.
Oh, thank you. And one more thing. We do have books on sale, and I'd be happy to sign any copies that you guys purchase. Thank you again. It's been an honor.